So hello there, Thomas. Really delighted to welcome you to this very first COVID conversation series that we're organising at the Open University to reflect on our project COVID Chronicles from the Margins. Just so everybody knows, Thomas is Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo, and he has been a really important influence on many of us who are ethnographers. His book, Small Places, Large Issues, has been a textbook all over the world. He's written on an impressive range of subjects from ethnicity and nationalism to public anthropology. So we're delighted to have you here today, Thomas, and thank you.
Likewise, thank you.
Okay, so uh, we got together, a few of us, just a small group of us, in March last year during lockdown, when we were all grounded. We could no longer do field work abroad or do ethnography face to face, and we decided to do a project working with the refugees and asylum seekers that we were at that time working with here in Swansea in South Wales. And we thought the project would last for 8 weeks. But we're still here. And as you have engaged with our COVID Chronicles website, I wondered if we could begin by asking you to reflect, maybe by selecting a couple of items that struck your attention, to give some personal reflections on the pandemic, because I think one of the most important things we were trying to do with this project is give a differing perspective, a new vantage point on the pandemic, because at the time people were saying, oh, COVID doesn't discriminate. But then, and now, we know even better that it does. So over to you, Thomas.
Yes, thanks very much, Marie. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's really, really nice to talk to you, as always. I mean, and well, for one thing, I think the COVID Chronicles project is incredibly important socially for people who are refugees and asylum seekers. You know, in some of the research that I've been doing in one of my groups in Eastern Oslo, where there are many refugees who have recently been settled in some of the suburbs. You've in fact met some of those people when you visited us a number of years ago. One of the first things we discovered was loneliness. You know, there were so many single refugees who didn't really have many friends, who didn't know many, didn't know the culture, they didn't know the language well, and they struggled. And yet there were places where they could go to find people who spoke their language, to get help with their Norwegian classes, to help filling out the forms for the bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And these venues are now closed. So people who were already in a socially precarious situation are even much, much worse off in the current during the current pandemic, which, as you suggest, you know, has lasted much longer than we expected in March. At the end of March last year, I was invited to give a talk in September, and we suggested as a title, after the pandemic, where are we going? And that was in September, right? And now we are talking in late January, and we can't really see the end of it yet. So it's been an incredibly important project, I think, for that reason. But it also tells us about the way in which the world has changed. Imagine a pandemic like this, with isolation, with the bans on mobility and closed shops and pubs and whatnot. 30 years ago, before people had mobile phones, it would have been much more difficult to connect, and people would have been even more isolated and lonelier. So what you've been doing with the COVID Chronicles is that you harnessed and exploited this new technology of mobile internet to create the kind of buzz, to create a community. And the result is, it's really amazing, and it's impressive and incredible. It's like a scrapbook, I mean, a diary. It's like a collectively produced, you know, ethnographic sort of document that you can wander around in the on the website and discover, hidden connections, little details, little stories, which together paint the picture of the situation during the pandemic for the refugees that the focus is on. And of course, it's also, in a sense, it's always a good thing. They call it empowering. That may be a useful word to begin with. At least it's a way of giving people a voice who otherwise would not have been heard, which is probably one of the most important things we do as ethnographers, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I could say much more, but as a beginning, I think this is a really important initiative, and probably we can do similar things after the pandemic as well, in order to create these connections between people who cannot meet and who can recognize themselves in other people's experiences. You hear a story from someone who feels lonely and marginal and confused in Kuala Lumpur, and you're sitting in Swansea or Oslo, and you realize that this could have been me. I'm in a similar situation. It's not just me. I'm not alone.
Thank you, Thomas. That's really important what you've said, because I think it is the way in which we can see our own experiences in those that are represented on the website, as you say. You chose 3 images in particular, and it would be lovely to hear your reflections on those and why you chose those and what you meant, or what they meant to you.
Yes. Well, I could have done others. There's such a wealth of fascinating stuff there, fascinating material of all kinds. But I picked out 3 which really struck me the moment I saw them. One of them was just a tangle. I mean, it represents the tangled life, the inextricable tangle. It's like the kind of knots that your fishing line may end up in on a bad day, which is, you simply can't take it apart. It's impossible. And this is the kind of labyrinth with no exit that many people feel that their life has become. It's chaotic. It's unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen next, as if we didn't have enough problems already. This as well comes into our life in addition to everything else. So in my own work with refugees, I can see that so many refugees feel that their lives are like that. There are so many things that you are not in control of, not in command of, and now the pandemic in addition. So that, I think, is it's a good, and it's also a little bit humorous. The next picture is really a piece of art. You could say that it's a very funny one, because it represents 2 famous paintings, Vincent van Gogh and the Mona Lisa, with face masks, okay, on the wall, and then up front on a pedestal, on a velvet cushion, okay, with encased in glass, you have these sort of sacred objects from the pandemic, the face mask, the bottle of disinfectant, the toilet rolls that people were hoarding in March last year, which also has, it has a sense of liveliness and a sense of humor. Seeing this phenomenon from the outside and seeing how it could be exhibited in a museum of history, perhaps in the future, because obviously we're living through a historical moment. Neither you nor I have experienced anything like this before, anything as encompassing and dramatic as this global crisis, which is still going on. So I rather like that, and also think it had some considerable artistic qualities. I wouldn't mind hanging it on my wall. And the third one is one of the most hopeful images, I think, in the collection, which represents, it's a photo of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, but it's not going to jump. He's just rejoicing in his freedom, stretching his arms upwards towards the blue sky, and reminding us that there's always hope. Even when things are a tangle, which look inextricable, even when everybody's suddenly wearing face masks, and other people become a threat and not potential, allies or companions, but they become dangerous, and so on. Even in that kind of situation, there's always hope, and let's not forget that.
That's very good to be reminded of that. Thomas, you talked a little bit about historical pandemics, and I wondered, given your interest in the history of anthropology,
Yeah.
etc., whether you wanted to say a few words about what we can learn from that history about how we might respond to the pandemic today and to living with that radical uncertainty and its consequences.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I know this is a big question, and I noticed that there are many commentators who say various things about, for example, what is the world going to look like after the pandemic, or how do people with a capital P behave during the pandemic? And I don't really believe in that way of asking the question, because history doesn't work that way. People don't work that way because we're so different. So you have seen perhaps the best and the worst in people during the pandemic. Big crises are like magnifying glasses. They blow up certain phenomena and they leave others in the dark. And certain tendencies that you've seen already are being reinforced and strengthened by the pandemic. So that people who, for example, who were suspicious of immigrants are becoming even more suspicious of immigrants afterwards. People who felt that now we really need to collaborate and we need to show that we are in this together and show some solidarity. They would, like yourself and your team in Swansea and elsewhere, they would go out of their way to do something. So there is no, as it were, there's no easy lesson, as it were, to be learned. But when it comes to pandemics in history, well, foreigners and outsiders have always been blamed for pandemics. The American president very early spoke about the Chinese virus in order to peg it to one of his competitors in the global business world. And now, in fact, in Norway, we now talk in a concerned voice about the British strain, which is the mutated virus that has entered into the country. But people fear the Brazilian strain even more. But when it comes to inclusion and exclusion, you can see that, border controls have been more rigidly enforced. For obvious reasons. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing. You're just noticing that border controls, people have been abroad, and people who come from abroad are treated differently, and minorities. In the past, it always used to be the Jews. In Europe, but the Jews tended to be blamed. During the Black Death in the high medieval period, the 14th century, even the Spanish flu, almost exactly 100 years ago, Jews were often blamed. And one of the reasons for placing Jews in ghettos in Eastern Europe was to contain, as it were, the danger, the kind of disease, the miasma, as they called it at the time, that the Jews were assumed to carry. And we should also be aware that this is a possible reaction to the current pandemic. We've seen tendencies in some European countries to blame minorities, because among certain minority populations, there has been a higher incidence. Although social scientists have been quick to show that, in fact, this is to do with class and with other things, and not with culture and so on. It is, of course, it's disconcerting when you have a humanistic approach to life to see how people increasingly now are being treated by each other as potential threats. You see it on a small scale. For example, when I line up in front of my local bakery, which is still open, to buy bread, sometimes the person in front of me, we all wear face masks, turns around and says, "Don't you know that you're supposed to keep social distancing because I'm just a wee bit too close?" That kind of instinctive reaction. You see that happen on a small scale. Of course, some of this is quite harmless, but it may enter into our collective psyche in a rather unhealthy way, and we should be aware of that. But then you have the other side, which is that of increased solidarity, which also takes place.
So I think what you're highlighting here, Thomas, is the ways in which classical anthropological concepts can really provide a prism through which we can understand life under the pandemic. And as you were
Yes.
talking, I was reminded of your work on Mary Douglas, and this idea that the more you live with uncertainty, certain people therefore seek security. The more you take risks, the more you have to live with uncertainty, and this kind of dynamism we see magnified. And I think that's your work on Mary Douglas, your work on ethnic boundary marking,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about how you see classical anthropological concepts illuminating
Yes.
this moment, this extraordinary moment?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, of course. I could go on about this forever, but I won't. Yes, I mean, to me, in my training as it was a student, there were a few books that you never forgot that somehow changed your life, changed your way of looking at the world, and one of them was Mary Douglas' Purity and Danger from 1966, because it says something about the way in which we uh, create boundaries between that which is okay and that which is not okay. Purity and danger is the name of the book, and that which is impure is dangerous. And it's dangerous. It can be dangerous in a very concrete way, such as viruses and bacteria. But it can also be dangerous in the sense that people who represent a different culture, different values, they eat different food, they have a different religion, they can also be dangerous. So she sees the boundaries that we have around our bodies and the way in which we try to keep our bodies clean as a kind of mirror to the way societies try to remain clean. And that is one way of beginning to think about the way societies work in terms of inclusion and exclusion. But I have something to add to this. But I just like to mention another book that also came out during the 1960s that I've also worked a lot with, and I've also written the biography of the editor, namely Fredrik Barth, who was a Norwegian anthropologist. The book Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, which in a way is a sociological, a slightly different version of the same argument that you find in Mary Douglas, which is about the way in which people create boundaries. And the point here is that boundaries are created socially. They're not a product of nature and not even a product of cultural differences. Cultural differences are something that you invoke after you've created the boundary in order to justify it. But one thing that is missing in both Mary Douglas and Fredrik Barth's accounts is a kind of thing that you and I have worked a lot with, and that you see all around yourself in the contemporary world, namely cultural mixing, hybridity, the frontier instead of the boundary, that which is neither this nor that, or maybe a bit of both, all sorts of mixing or creolization, and what our colleague Stephen Vertevek has spoken of as super diversity, where you get the kind of diversity where you cannot really talk about groups anymore because there's so much diversity of all kinds. You have sexual minorities, you have people who are secular but religious, but they have similar names and come from the same place. So you can't really make any predictions about how people are. And I think that is a fruitful way to move on from the obsession with boundaries and to point out that, in fact, these boundaries, they're relative, they're created by people, they can be changed, and they're also what we call in anthropology situational, which means that in some situations, a boundary is important, and in another situation it isn't. I mean, when I walk around in my neighborhood, I'm not a Norwegian because everybody's Norwegian, right? But when I go to England, I become a Scandinavian, or maybe even a Norwegian. So these the identities that are made relevant, they change and they shift. And I think one of the things that we should think about in the context of the pandemic is that these boundaries need to be interrogated. They are not absolute. There's no way you can protect yourself 100%. So you might as well cooperate with others, right? Because people will socialize, they will move, and there will be contact. And even nobody outside of North Korea wants to be North Korea, but even North Korea hasn't been able to protect itself from the virus.
This is very true, Thomas, and I think it's an important message to get across. And I really like the way you bring in Mary Douglas and Bart and Steve Vertevek. You have, though, played an important role as a public anthropologist in Norway. And I think some of the ideas that you've just been expressing about the fragility and fluidity of boundaries is a really important point to get across. And I think in some of your writing, you've talked about the point being that we just don't analyze the world. We need to make it a slightly better place for us all to live in. So just to end this conversation, could you talk a little bit about how you see either yourself or other anthropologists playing a public role in actually shifting people's perceptions of the pandemic and really
Hmm.
taking on Arundhati Roy's challenge, if you like, that this pandemic is a
Hmm.
portal. It's an
Yes.
opportunity to to reinvent our world and reimagine our world for the better.
Yes, I entirely agree. In fact, I wrote an essay myself with the title "A Window of Opportunity," which is really, I said many of the same things. In fact, so I recognized Arundhati Roy's thoughts very much in my own visions of what the world could be like and how we could use this as a window of opportunity to do things slightly differently. Yes, I mean, crisis. I mean, the ancient Greeks used the term crisis, krisis, which was generally used as a medical term. A crisis was a high fever. And we still use it sometimes in English in the same sense, going through a critical phase, etc. And after a crisis in ancient Greece, when they didn't have antibiotics, okay? So when you had a high fever, there were two possible outcomes. You died or you recovered. Okay, if you died, that was the end of the story, end of your life. But if you recovered, things would still not be the same again. If you were wise enough to reflect on what had happened to you, because you realize that I am vulnerable, I should be more humble, I should be more grateful, and I should notice the little things nearby that I passed by so quickly in the past because I never had the time, because I was rushing off to do something that I felt was more important. And so you see where I'm getting, Marie. I mean, that this crisis, obviously, it's not going to be the end, okay? We're going to recover. But after that recovery, let us hope that we will be wiser, both as people, individuals, and as a society, so that we can use the crisis as a pretext for doing things differently, to rethink, for example, work. There is not going to be enough for everyone. Lots of people have been laid off or temporarily, or their jobs are uncertain, both in the global north and the global south. Suppose we thought about the economy, as many economic anthropologists do, as not a means to generate profits for already absurdly rich people, but as a means to satisfy certain human needs. The needs to make yourself useful, the need to get recognition for what you do, and perhaps the need to do something for others. Which are, very fundamental human needs, which are consistently underestimated by 20th and 21st century economists. So we could rethink economics, and maybe we have to do it. Maybe it's going to be thrust upon us as an imperative, because there's not going to be enough work for everyone in the conventional sense. So new forms of work. That's one way. And another thing, which I also have been thinking about when watching all the wonderful posts in the COVID Chronicles, both the text, the images, and the videos. It's such a rich material. Is that so much of it is very concrete. It's very what we call experience near. It's like about that little that little piece of lawn where your children are having a picnic, or about a birthday party with a cake with candles, or this guy who works as a delivery worker, as a delivery boy in Amsterdam and works for his job. You can see these people in front of you, and you realize that most of the things that are happening to us and which are important to us are very nearby. And now that we no longer fly around the world to talk about the climate crisis, we stay at home. I just spoke to a colleague in Denmark, in Aarhus in Denmark, which is the second largest city in Denmark. And she said that, since March, she hadn't been more than 12 kilometers, that's about 8 miles, away from her flat. And she used to fly to the States and to Eastern Europe and all over the place. And I asked her, how do you feel about that? Well, she rather enjoyed it. And I have had the same experience myself. I've become familiar with my own neighborhood in a way that I never did, although I've lived there for many years in the past. So I think there are some lessons here. And the thing we can learn from anthropology in general is that there are many recipes for the good life. There are different recipes for the good society. Ours is just one, the one that we've been living, sort of the one that predominates in neoliberal globalization. It's just one. And there are many ways to approach the challenges of life. So I hope that we can use some of this knowledge to stimulate our own intellectual and political imagination, to begin to think about a world which is slightly different, more sustainable, more equitable, and maybe a bit scaled down and cooled down and slowed down.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think it's wonderful to end on that message of solidarity and hope. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you very much indeed for all those rich insights that I'm sure will make us all think a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you.